Mark adjusted the worn beanie on his head, pulling it down until it almost covered his eyes. His clothes, carefully chosen to look old and dirty, smelled of smoke and dirt. He took a deep breath, preparing to step into the role he had created for himself. The restaurant Le Chic was one of the most elegant in New York. Its bright windows let in the golden light of crystal chandeliers, and the aroma of expensive dishes wafted in the cool night air. Mark hesitated for a moment before pushing open the heavy door. As soon as he entered, he felt the eyes turn to him. Well-dressed customers stopped in the middle of their conversations. Waiters froze with trays in their hands. The silence that fell over the restaurant was almost palpable. Mark walked slowly towards the bar, each step feeling as if he were walking on broken glass. He could hear the whispers starting to spread like a wave. What is he doing here? Someone call security. How dare he enter this place? Mark ignored the comments, keeping his eyes fixed on his goal. He approached the bar and sat down on one of the high leather stools. The bartender, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed mustache, looked at Mark with a mixture of surprise and disgust. "Can I help?" he asked, his tone making it clear that the last thing he wanted was to help. Mark cleared his throat, letting his voice come out hoarse and tired. "Please, sir. I haven't eaten in days. Could you give me something? Anything would do." The bartender frowned, looking around nervously. "Look, buddy, this isn't the right place for you. Why don't you try a shelter or something?" Before Mark could respond, a waiter hurriedly approached. His face was red with anger and embarrassment. "Sir, you need to leave now," he said in a low but firm voice. "This is a respectable establishment. We don't serve ... people like you here." Mark felt a pang in his chest at those words. Even though I knew it was all an act, the rejection hurt. He wondered how many people actually went through this every day. "Please," Mark insisted, his voice shaking a little. "I just need some food. I can work to pay for it if you want. I can wash dishes, mop floors, anything." The waiter looked increasingly uncomfortable. He looked around, noticing that several customers were observing the scene with both interest and disgust. "Sir, I'm going to have to call security if you don't leave now," the waiter threatened. At this moment, a burly man in an expensive suit approached. His face was red with anger, and he smelled of expensive alcohol. "What the hell is going on here?" he roared. "How did you let these scum into my restaurant?" Mark recognized the man as Robert Thornton, the restaurant manager. He cowered a little, playing the part of someone scared and intimidated. "Sorry, sir," Mark muttered. "I just wanted some food." Robert looked at Mark as if he were something unpleasant stuck to his shoe. "Food? You think this is a homeless shelter? This is a classy restaurant. People like you are not welcome here." Robert's words were like stabs, each one making Mark feel smaller and less human. He wondered how many people had given up asking for help after being treated like this. "Please," Mark tried once more. "I can work. I can do anything." Robert let out a cruel laugh. "Work? Look at you. You wouldn't even be good enough to clean the bathrooms here. Now get out before I call the police." Mark stood up slowly, feeling the stares of everyone in the restaurant. Some seemed pleased to see him go, others seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but no one said anything. No one offered to help. As he walked towards the door, Mark noticed a young waiter standing near the kitchen. The boy watched him with a different expression than the others. There was no contempt in his eyes, just sadness and compassion. Mark made a mental note to watch that waiter later. For now he had a role to play. He left the restaurant, the door closing behind him with a final thud. Outside, Mark leaned against the wall of the building, letting out a heavy sigh. The experience had been more intense than he expected. The contempt, the rejection, the dehumanization, it all weighed heavy on his heart. He looked out the restaurant window, watching people return to their expensive meals and carefree conversations. It was as if he had never existed for them, as if it were invisible. Mark knew his experiment was far from over. He needed to go back, needed to see if anyone would be willing to show a little kindness. He thought of the young waiter he had noticed. Maybe there was a glimmer of hope there. Adjusting his beanie once more, Mark prepared to re-enter the restaurant. This time he would try a different approach. Maybe if he could talk to someone one-on-one, away from the judgmental eyes of the other customers, he would find some compassion. With renewed determination, Mark walked to the back entrance of the restaurant. He knew this would be the area where employees took their breaks, where maybe he could find someone willing to listen. As he approached the back door, Mark saw the young waiter he had noticed earlier leaving for a break. It was his chance. "Excuse me," Mark called softly, trying not to startle the boy. "Could you help me?" The waiter turned around, surprised. For a moment, Mark feared he would see the same contempt he had seen in others. But to his surprise, the young man's face softened with a gentle smile. "Of course," he replied. "How can I help?" Mark felt a rush of relief and gratitude. Maybe, just maybe, he had found someone who still saw the humanity behind the dirty clothes and unkempt appearance. "My name is John," the waiter introduced himself, extending his hand to Mark. Mark hesitated for a moment before shaking the offered hand. John's simple gesture, treating him as an equal, as a human being worthy of respect, almost made Mark drop his disguise right then and there. But he knew he needed to continue. I needed to see how far John's kindness went. I needed to understand what motivated this compassion in a world that seemed so cold and indifferent. "Thank you, John," Mark said, his voice cracking with genuine emotion. "You don't know how much it means to me to be treated like a person." John smiled, a sad, understanding smile. "We are all people, no matter our situation. Now tell me, how can I help?" And so, under the starry New York sky, in the back alley of an elegant restaurant, a conversation began. A conversation that would change both men's lives in ways neither could imagine. John looked at the man in front of him, noticing details that others had overlooked. He saw the calloused hands, the tired but still bright eyes. He saw a human being who needed help. "Come with me," John said gently. "Let's go in and get you something to eat." Mark hesitated. "But the manager, won't he be mad?" John smiled. "Don't worry about him. I know a way around the back. No one will see us." They entered silently through the kitchen door. The smell of food made Mark's stomach growl. John guided him to a small supply closet. "Wait here," John whispered. "I'll get you something." Mark watched John move around the kitchen. The young waiter took a plate and began filling it with leftovers from various dishes. A piece of chicken here, some potatoes there, a handful of vegetables. To Mark, it felt like a feast. John returned with a full plate and a glass of water. "Here," he said, handing the food to Mark. "It's not much, but it should help." Mark picked up the plate with shaking hands. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking with genuine emotion. "You don't know how much that means." While Mark ate, John sat next to him on the floor of the closet. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mark," he replied between bites. He decided that at this point he could use his real name. John nodded. "Mark, how did you get into this situation?" Mark stopped eating for a moment. He had not prepared a detailed backstory for his character. He decided to improvise, mixing elements of real stories he had heard in his years of philanthropic work. I lost my job a few months ago," Mark began. "I thought I would find someone else soon, but things got difficult. I lost my apartment, then my car. Now I'm on the streets." John listened intently, his eyes full of compassion. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mark. It must be really hard." Mark nodded, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "It's difficult. But the worst thing isn't the hunger or the cold, it's how people treat you, as if you were invisible. Or worse, as if you were trash." John looked down, looking embarrassed. "I know, I saw how people treated you out there. It's not fair." There was a moment of silence as Mark finished his meal. John picked up the empty plate and set it aside. "Mark," he said, hesitantly, "I want to help you. Not just with food. Maybe I can help you find a job." Mark looked at John, surprised. "Would you do that for me?" John smiled. "Of course. Everyone deserves a chance. Besides, he paused, as if deciding whether to continue. I know what it's like to need help. Mark tilted his head curiously. Like this? John sighed, his eyes getting lost in a distant memory. A few years ago, my father became very ill. I had to drop out of college to take care of him. We lost almost everything paying the medical bills. There were times when I thought we would end up on the street. Mark listened intently, feeling a growing admiration for this young waiter. How did you get over it? He asked. John smiled sadly. Good people, neighbors who brought food, a teacher who helped me get this job. Small acts of kindness that made all the difference. Mark felt a lump in his throat. John's story touched him deeply. He thought of all the people who went through similar struggles every day, people who just needed an outstretched hand, someone who cared. Your father, Mark began hesitantly. Is he okay now? John's smile widened a little. Yes, he's better. He still needs care, but he's at home. I work here at night and take care of him during the day. Mark shook his head in amazement. You're a good son, John, and a good person. John blushed a little at the compliment. I'm just trying to repay the kindness I've received. Now, how about we start thinking about how to get you a job? Over the next few minutes, John taught Mark some basic restaurant tasks. How to fold napkins elegantly, how to polish silverware until it shines, how to set a table for a formal dinner. These are things we do every day here, John explained. If you learn well, I might recommend you for an interview. Maybe not here, but I know other restaurants that might be hiring. Mark struggled to learn, impressed by John's patience and teaching ability. He wondered how many other talents this young waiter possessed, talents that went unnoticed in the busy day-to-day life of the restaurant. As they practiced, John shared more about his life. He talked about his dreams of going back to college one day, about his love of cooking, about the small joys he found in his work, despite the difficulties. Mark listened to everything, absorbing every word. He felt humbled by the strength and kindness of this young man who, despite his own struggles, still found the energy to help a stranger. Suddenly, the closet door opened. Mark and John froze, staring at the imposing figure of Robert, the manager, standing in the entrance. What the hell is going on here? Robert roared, his face red with anger. John stood up quickly, placing himself between Mark and Robert. Mr. Thornton, I can explain. Robert interrupted him. Explain what? How did you let this bum in my kitchen? How are you wasting food on him? Mark flinched, playing the role of someone scared and embarrassed. But inside, he was furious at Robert's treatment of John. John, however, stood his ground. Mr. Thornton, this man needed help. I was only doing what was right. Robert let out a bitter laugh. What's right is to protect this establishment from people like him. What's right is to serve our paying customers, not feed beggars. Mark watched, impressed, as John didn't back down. The young waiter straightened his shoulders and looked directly into Robert's eyes. With all due respect, Sir John said, his voice calm but firm, I believe the right thing to do is to treat everyone with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. Robert turned red with anger. Are you telling me how to run my restaurant, boy? No, Sir John replied. I'm just saying how I choose to treat people. If that's a problem, then maybe this isn't the right place for me to work. Mark gaped at John's courage. Here was a young man willing to risk his job, which he needed so much, to defend a stranger. It was an act of kindness and integrity that Mark had rarely seen in his life. Robert looked like he was about to explode. Well, if that's how you feel, maybe you'd better. But before Robert could finish his sentence, a voice interrupted from the kitchen door. What's going on here? Everyone turned to see an elegantly dressed man standing at the entrance. Mark recognized him as one of the restaurant's regular customers, an influential man in the New York business community. Robert immediately changed his posture, forcing a smile. Mr. Thompson, don't worry, we're just dealing with a small situation here. Mr. Thompson looked from Robert to John, then to Mark. His eyes widened a little when he saw the homeless man in the kitchen, but instead of contempt, his gaze showed curiosity. "What situation would that be?" he asked. John, still standing protectively in front of Mark, responded, "I was just helping this man, sir. He needed food and a chance." Mr. Thompson looked at John for a long moment, then turned to Robert. "And that's a problem because—" Robert stuttered, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, Mr. Thompson, we have standards to maintain. We can't just let anyone come in and—" "Standards, Mr. Thompson interrupted. "What standards would those be? Cruelty? Indifference? Because from what I've seen and heard here, the only one who is maintaining any standards of decency is this young waiter." Robert went pale, speechless. Mr. Thompson approached John and Mark. "What's your name, young man?" he asked John. "John, sir," he replied. Mr. Thompson smiled. "Well, John, I'm impressed by your compassion and integrity. The world needs more people like you." He turned to Mark. "What about you, my friend? What's your story?" Mark hesitated, looking at John. The young waiter nodded encouragingly. "My name is Mark, sir," he began. I've fallen on hard times. John was the first in a long time to treat me like a human being." Mr. Thompson listened intently, his face showing a mixture of compassion and something else. Admiration. "Well, Mark," he said finally, "it looks like you found a friend in John. And John, you've earned my respect today. In fact, you've earned a lot more than that." Mark and John exchanged confused looks. What did Mr. Thompson mean by that? Mr. Thompson looked around the kitchen, his eyes passing over Mark, John, and Robert. He seemed to be thinking deeply about something. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "I think we have a unique opportunity here. A chance to learn and grow." Robert frowned, confused. "What do you mean, Mr. Thompson?" Mr. Thompson smiled gently. "I mean, sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. John, would you mind showing us what you were teaching Mark?" John looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, sir. I was showing Mark how to set a table for a formal dinner." "Excellent," said Mr. Thompson. "Why don't we do it now? Mark, can you show us what you learned?" Mark hesitated, looking to John for support. John smiled encouragingly. "Go ahead, Mark," he said. "You can do it." With his hands shaking a little, Mark began setting up a nearby table. He carefully laid out the towel, smoothing out the folds. Then, with slow but precise movements, he positioned the plates, cutlery, and glasses. As Mark worked, Mr. Thompson watched closely. Robert looked uncomfortable but said nothing. When Mark finished, Mr. Thompson inspected the table. "Impressive," he said. "For someone who's never done this before, you learned quickly." Mark lowered his head, humble. "I had a good teacher, Mr. Thompson turned to John. "Indeed. John, you have a natural talent for teaching. Have you ever thought about pursuing that career?" John blushed a little. "Actually, sir, that was my dream. I was studying to be a teacher before. Well, before I had to drop out of college to take care of my sick father." Mr. Thompson nodded understandingly. "Life sometimes takes us down unexpected paths, but maybe this dream can still come true." He turned to Robert, who had been quiet throughout the demonstration. "Robert, what do you think of all this?" Robert looked uncomfortable. "Well, Mr. Thompson, I don't know what to say. This is all very irregular." "Irregular, Mr. Thompson repeated. "Or maybe that's just what this restaurant needs. A reminder of our shared humanity." At this moment, the kitchen door opened again. A well-dressed man entered, his face red with anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "I've been waiting for my dinner for 20 minutes. Mark recognized the man as one of the customers he had seen at the restaurant earlier. He seemed like the kind of person who was used to having everything his way. Robert immediately went into manager mode. "I apologize, sir. I will resolve this immediately." But before Robert could do anything, the customer spotted Mark. His eyes narrowed in anger. "It's him," the customer shouted, pointing at Mark. "It's the beggar who was bothering everyone earlier. What is he doing here? Why are you talking to him?" John stepped forward, ready to defend Mark, but Mr. Thompson raised a hand, silencing him. "Sir, Mr. Thompson said calmly to the angry customer, "I ask you to calm down. We are in the middle of a very important lesson here." The customer looked at Mr. Thompson, recognizing him. "Mr. Thompson, what's going on?" Mr. Thompson smiled. "We are learning about compassion, dignity, and the value of every human being. Would you like to join us?" The customer looked confused. I don't understand. I came here for dinner, not a morals lesson." "Sometimes, Mr. Thompson said gently, the most important lessons come when we least expect it. Mark here," he gestured to Mark, "has shown us something valuable today. That we shouldn't judge people by their appearance or circumstance." The customer looked at Mark, then at John, then back at Mr. Thompson. His anger seemed to be subsiding, replaced by curiosity. "What do you mean?" he asked. Mr. Thompson smiled. "Why don't you ask John? He can tell you about the kindness he showed a stranger today." John, encouraged by Mr. Thompson's gaze, stepped forward. He told the customer about how he had found Mark, how he had decided to help him, and how he had discovered that Mark was able to quickly learn restaurant tasks. As John spoke, the customer's face changed. Anger was replaced by shame, then reluctant understanding. I didn't know," the customer finally said. "I never thought." "Exactly, Mr. Thompson said gently. "Often we don't think. We don't stop to consider the stories behind the people we see. But when we do, when we show a little compassion, we can discover surprising things." The customer looked at Mark. I'm sorry for the way I acted before. It wasn't right." Mark nodded, accepting the apology. "Thank you," he said simply. Mr. Thompson clapped his hands, getting everyone's attention. "Well, I think we all learned something valuable today. But the night isn't over yet. Robert, what do you say we give Mark a chance to work tonight?" Robert looked shocked. "Work? But he has no experience, he's not dressed properly, He's a human being willing to work hard, Mr. Thompson interrupted gently. "Isn't that enough to deserve a chance?" Robert looked around, seeing everyone's expectant faces. Finally, he sighed. "Okay, Mark can help in the kitchen tonight, but John, you're responsible for him." John smiled widely. "Yes, sir. You won't regret it." Mr. Thompson turned to his customer. "What about you, sir? Would you like to be served by our new employee tonight?" The customer hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I would. It would be an honor." For the next few hours, Mark worked hard in the kitchen, washing dishes, helping prepare salads, doing whatever was asked of him. John was always there, guiding and encouraging. The customer, who had been so angry before, was watching everything with interest. He even praised Mark when he served his dessert. At the end of the night, as the restaurant was closing, Mr. Thompson brought everyone together again. "Well, what did you think of today's experience?" he asked. Robert was the first to speak. "It was enlightening," he admitted. "Mark worked hard, harder than some of our regular employees." John smiled proudly. "I knew he could do it. Sometimes people just need a chance." The customer nodded. "I learned a valuable lesson today. I will never judge someone just by their appearance again." Mark looked at everyone, feeling a rush of gratitude. I don't know how to thank all of you, especially you, John. You treated me like a human being when no one else did." Mr. Thompson smiled, looking pleased. "Well, I think we've all grown up a little today. But the night isn't over yet. I have an announcement to make." Everyone looked at him, curious. "As some of you know, I'm more than just a regular customer here. I'm actually the owner of this restaurant." Robert turned pale. "What? But I thought." Mr. Thompson raised a hand. "I know, Robert. I prefer to keep a low profile. But after what I saw today, I realized it was time to reveal myself." He turned to John. John, your compassion and teaching ability impressed me profoundly. I would like to offer you a full scholarship to finish your degree in education. John gaped. I don't know what to say. Thank you, sir. Mr. Thompson then turned to Mark. And Mark, your willingness to work hard and learn quickly has not gone unnoticed. I would like to offer you a permanent job here at the restaurant if you want. Mark felt tears in his eyes. Yes, sir. I would love to. Thank you. Finally, Mr. Thompson turned to Robert. Robert, you have a lot to learn about leadership and compassion, but I'm willing to give you a chance, just like we gave Mark. What do you think about working alongside Mark for a while? Maybe you two can learn from each other. Robert, still shocked by all the revelations, just nodded. Mr. Thompson smiled, looking around at everyone. Well, I think we had quite a night. Always remember this lesson: every person has value, every person deserves respect. And sometimes kindness can come from the most unexpected places. The sun had barely risen when Mark arrived at Le Chic the next morning. He stopped in front of the restaurant, looking at the elegant facade. It was hard to believe that just a day ago he had been kicked out of this very place. Mark adjusted the new uniform that Mr. Thompson had provided for him. The clean, pressed clothes were a physical reminder of the change in his life. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage, and entered. Inside the restaurant, the morning team was already busy preparing everything for the day. Mark saw John setting the tables, his face shining with a smile when he saw Mark. "Good morning," John called, waving. "Ready for your first official day?" Mark smiled back, feeling nervous but excited. "I guess so. It still feels like a dream." John walked over, placing a comforting hand on Mark's shoulder. "It's not a dream. You deserved it. Now, let's begin." As John showed Mark his tasks for the day, Robert entered the restaurant. The manager looked uncomfortable, avoiding looking directly at Mark or John. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton," John said politely. Robert mumbled something that could have been a good morning and quickly headed to his office. Mark looked at John, worried. He still looks angry. John shrugged. "Give him time. Change doesn't happen overnight. The important thing is that you're here and you have a chance to prove yourself." John's words calmed Mark, and he focused on learning his new tasks. He cleaned tables, polished cutlery, and helped in the kitchen. Each task, no matter how simple it was carried out with care and dedication. As the day progressed, Mark noticed Robert occasionally coming out of his office to watch him work. The manager still looked suspicious, but Mark could see a hint of surprise in his eyes. During lunch, the restaurant was full. Mark worked hard, running back and forth to help wherever he was needed. He noticed that some customers were looking at him curiously, probably recognizing him from the day before. One of those customers was the man who had gotten angry the night before. He motioned for Mark to come over to his table. "Hello," the man said, looking a little embarrassed. I wanted to apologize again for my behavior yesterday. You're doing a great job today." Mark felt a surge of emotion. "Thank you, sir. It means a lot to me." The man smiled. "Well, it looks like we all learned a valuable lesson yesterday. I'm glad to see you have this opportunity." As the day progressed, Mark continued to work hard. He noticed that, little by little, the other employees began to accept his presence. Some even offered helpful tips and advice. At the end of the day, as the restaurant was closing, Mr. Thompson showed up. He gathered the entire team, including Robert, who reluctantly left his office. "Well, Mr. Thompson began, how was the first day of our new arrangement?" John was the first to speak. "Mark was amazing, Mr. Thompson. He worked hard and learned quickly." Other employees murmured in agreement. Mark felt his face heat up at the compliment. Mr. Thompson turned to Robert. "What about you, Robert? What do you think?" Robert looked uncomfortable but finally spoke. He worked well. Better than I expected, to be honest." Mr. Thompson smiled. "See? Sometimes all people need is a chance. Mark, how did you feel today?" Mark thought for a moment before responding. "It was one of the best days of my life, Mr. Thompson. Not just for the job, but for being treated with respect, for being seen as a person, not a problem." Mr. Thompson nodded, satisfied. "That's what it's all about, guys. Seeing the humanity in every person, giving everyone a chance to prove themselves." He turned to the entire team. "I want all of you to take this lesson home today. Think about how you can bring more compassion and understanding into your daily lives. And remember, every little act of kindness can make a big difference." As everyone prepared to leave, Mark approached John. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." John smiled. "No need to thank me. Just promise you'll pass it on when you get the chance." Mark nodded, feeling emotional. "I promise." In the days and weeks that followed, Mark continued to work hard at Lashish. He saw changes happening not only in his own life, but also in the lives of those around him. Robert, little by little, began to change his attitude. He was still demanding, but now he treated all employees with more respect. Mark even caught him once helping an elderly customer get to his table. John started his degree in education, balancing studies with work at the restaurant. He often shared with Mark what he was learning, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. Mark himself discovered he had a natural talent for cooking. The restaurant's chef began teaching him some basic techniques, and Mark absorbed each lesson with enthusiasm. One day, about 2 months after Mark started at Lashish, Mr. Thompson called him in for a private conversation. "Mark," he said, "I'm impressed with your progress. Not only have you learned quickly, but you've also inspired positive change throughout the team." Mark lowered his head, humble. "Thank you, sir. I'm just trying to repay you for the chance you gave me." Mr. Thompson smiled. "And that's why I want to offer something to you. We're opening a new restaurant downtown, a place that will offer free meals to people experiencing homelessness, as well as job and training opportunities. I'd like you to be the manager of this restaurant." Mark gaped. "Me? But I barely know how to cook." Mr. Thompson laughed. "It's not just about cooking, Mark. It's about understanding people, about having compassion. And you have that in spades. Plus, you know firsthand the struggles these people face. Who better to lead a project like this?" Mark felt tears in his eyes. I don't know what to say. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I won't let you down." "I know you won't, Mr. Thompson said gently. "Now how about we share the good news with the team?" When Mark and Mr. Thompson announced the news, there was an explosion of applause and congratulations. John was the first to hug Mark, his eyes shining with pride. Even Robert came over to shake Mark's hand. "Congratulations," he said, looking genuinely happy. "You deserve." That night, after the restaurant closed, the staff organized a small party for Mark. There was food, laughter, and lots of stories shared. In a calm moment, Mark found himself alone with John. "You know," Mark said, "none of this would have happened if it weren't for you. You changed my life, John." John smiled, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You changed mine too, Mark. You reminded me why I wanted to be a teacher in the first place, to make a difference in people's lives." Mark nodded, feeling emotional. "Well, Professor John, I think you are already doing that, and you will continue to do so for many years to come." The two friends sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the incredible journey they had been on together. Finally, Mark spoke again. "You know what's funny? This all started because I was hungry. And now I'm going to help feed other people who are going through what I went through." John smiled. "This is how the world changes, Mark. One person at a time, one act of kindness at a time." Mark looked around the restaurant at the people who had become his family. He thought about all the lives that had been touched and changed in the last few months, and he thought about all the lives that would still be transformed in the future. "You're right, John," he said. "And you know what? I can't wait to see what comes next." As the party continued around him, Mark felt a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had friends, he had support, and most importantly, he had the chance to make a difference. Mark smiled, thinking about all the people he would help in his new job. People who, like him, just needed a chance, someone who saw beyond appearances and recognized their value. And as the sun set over New York City, Mark knew a new day was dawning, a day full of possibilities, hope and change, a day when every person, no matter their situation, would be treated with dignity and respect. It was a new beginning. For Mark, for John, for Robert, and for all those whose lives they would touch. And it all started with a simple act of kindness in a fancy New York restaurant.